Hey everyone, I'm Corey Huffman and welcome to another video analyzing the writing style of George R.R. Martin. In this video, I'll be analyzing Martin's prose with regards to how he melds the active voice with the passive voice, and in so doing explain the effect that each voice has on the reader, as well as when it's appropriate to implement one voice over the other, and why. I've pulled several excerpts from Martin's novel, A Clash of Kings, each of which exemplifies one of the 6 formats I'd like to discuss. They are as follows. Using the active voice to describe an action, using the passive voice to describe an action, using the active voice to describe something that is perceived, that is, through the 5 senses, and likewise using the passive voice to describe a perception. And finally, intermingling both the passive and active voices within an action sequence, as well as within a perceptive sequence. With regards to the intermingling of these 2 voices in an action sequence, I'll take you through several chronological excerpts from the Siege of King's Landing, so I can show you how Martin implements the active and passive voices on a larger scale. But first, I'd be remiss if I didn't explain my use of the words active and passive, or the ways in which I extend their meanings a bit beyond their dictionary definitions, for the purpose of developing what I have found to be a very practical mindset when it comes to the writing of narrative prose. First and foremost, an active sentence is when the verb immediately follows its doer, known as the subject, as in, the man punched the wall. Punched here is the verb, the man is the subject, and the wall is what I like to call the object, that which interacts with the subject via the verb. In a passive sentence, however, the object is introduced prior to the subject, often with the word was used to connect the object with the verb, such as, the wall was punched by the man. Now, where I take a few liberties with such definitions, as pointed out by one of my very astute subscribers, at ClintonTaylor5131, is when it comes to sentences like, the sky was blue. I've taken to calling these sentences passive because of the use of the word was, even though this isn't really passive or active, seeing as there is no verb. It's really just a statement of fact. There are also sentences like, the tree was burning, which falls under the category of what is called the imperfect tense, describing an action or process that is incomplete, as opposed to the perfect tense, the tree burned down to its roots, which describes a process that has been completed. So for all of you literary scholars out there, just know that what I refer to as the active voice, for simplicity's sake, includes reference to the perfect tense, and the passive voice includes reference to the imperfect tense. This is because, as you'll soon see, the imperfect tense has a passive feel to it, as well as sharing the same narrative flavor. You can think of it this way: the active voice, or perfect tense, feels close, like you're putting the reader right in the character's shoes. It also feels immediate, vivid, and impactful. The passive voice, or imperfect tense, however, is distant, like the reader is a bit further removed from the character's experience, as well as slower paced and more easily digested, allowing the reader a bit of rest if they've been bombarded by the active voice for a while. But we'll get into the effects of both voices in more detail as we go along. Instead, let's start off looking at the first of the 5 structures, namely, using the active voice to describe a character's actions. Hotpie leapt to his feet. I yield. He threw away his sword as dozens of crows rose shrieking and complaining to flap about the corpses. Arya grabbed his leg and tried to drag him back down, but he wrenched loose and ran forward, waving his arms. I yield, I yield. She bounced up and drew needle, but by then men were all around her. Arya slashed at the nearest, but he blocked her with a steel-clad arm, and someone else slammed into her and dragged her to the ground, and a third man wrenched the sword from her grasp. When she tried to bite, her teeth snapped shut on cold, dirty chainmail. Oh, a fierce one, the man said, laughing. The blow from his ironclad fist near knocked her head off. What I want to draw your attention to here is how just about every sentence has been written in the active voice. We start with Hotpie leapt, then he threw, crows rose, Arya grabbed, tried to drag, he wrenched, she bounced up and drew, Arya slashed, he blocked, someone else slammed, then dragged, a third man wrenched, she tried to bite, her teeth snapped shut, and the blow knocked. There are some passive elements here as well, and I'll get into those shortly, but first let's dig deeper into the essence of what the active voice truly is. Think of it this way. An active sentence originates at the character of interest, which may vary from sentence to sentence, and works its way outward, as in, he blocked her with a steel-clad arm, while a passive sentence works in the opposite way, originating from the consequence or the target of the action, and working its way toward the source, as in, she was blocked by his steel-clad arm. The most common passive elements found in an action sequence, however, are what are called ing verbs, namely any verb that ends with the letters ing, giving it that ing sound. We can see examples of this here, with the verbs shrieking and complaining, waving, and laughing. Working these ing verbs into otherwise active sentences is a great way to add a splash of the passive voice, often without the need for passive words like was, were, or had, but try not to overuse them, or else that ing sound will start to feel repetitive for the reader and soften the impact of your sentences. Ed verbs tend to pack more of a punch, and so are generally preferred. Notice also how some sentences just sound dumb when written passively. Instead of writing, "Hot Pie leapt to his feet," which is active, you could write something stupid like, "His feet were leapt to by him," or a little less dumb, "Hot Pie was leaping to his feet," which could actually work depending on the scenario. You could write, "Hot Pie was leaping to his feet when a man burst through the door," beginning passive and ending active. But if you want to really plant your reader in the character's shoes, moment by moment, which is necessary if you want to generate feelings like anticipation or surprise, I'd strongly recommend writing the action beats of your story in the active voice. There are, however, some instances where the passive voice is well suited to describing an active scene, such as our next excerpt, which is an example of the second structure, namely, using the passive voice to describe an action sequence. On the walls of King's Landing, Spitfires were belching death, and the great trebuchets behind the mudgate were throwing boulders. In this instance, using the passive voice, which, as you can see, tends to give rise to ing verbs, lends a dynamic feel to the narration. Spitfires belching death and great trebuchets throwing boulders are actions in motion, things that are in the process of happening, as opposed to things which have happened. Passive or imperfect sentences like these create a little video or GIF in the reader's mind, and often help to broaden the scope of what is going on in the surroundings of the prospective character. Moving on to the third structure of interest, namely using the active voice / perfect tense to describe something that is perceived, we have here Martin's description of a war camp. Thousands of cook fires filled the air with a pale, smoky haze. The horse lines alone stretched out over leagues. A forest had surely been felled to make the tall staffs that held the banners. Great siege engines lined the grassy verge of the Rose Road, mangonels and trebuchets and rolling rams mounted on wheels taller than a man on horseback. The steel points of spikes flamed red with sunlight, as if already bloodied, while the pavilions of the knights and high lords sprouted from the grass like silken mushrooms. As you can see here, even though no actions are being taken by anyone, most of these descriptive beats, most of which are static perceptions, meaning no motion or change of state is associated with them, are written in the active voice. Cook fires filled, the horse lines stretched, siege engines lined, pikes flamed, pavilions sprouted. This is where you, as a writer, get to be a bit creative with your choice of verbs. For example, pikes can't literally flame, no more than pavilions can sprout from the grass like mushrooms. But sometimes you'll find it takes being a little imaginative to describe something your reader may have never experienced, or that which is beyond compare. As a rule of thumb, I'd recommend describing sensory perceptions in the active voice when you want the reader to really pay attention, and describe them in the passive voice when you are describing bits of information that may not be critical, but are still relevant and necessary. This ties nicely into our fourth structure, that is, using the passive voice or imperfect tense to describe something that is perceived. The rain might have stopped, but the compound was still a morass of shallow lakes and slippery mud. Black brothers were folding their tents, feeding their horses, and chewing on strips of salt beef. Yarm and Buckwell's scouts were tightening the girths on their saddles before setting out. As is plain to see, this description is hardly pivotal to the plot or of any large importance, but nevertheless, this information must still be conveyed to set the stage. Notice the passive words was and were used in each sentence, and all the ing verbs as well, feeding, chewing, tightening, and setting. If you wanted to use the active voice and really draw the reader in, you might write about how the slippery mud sucked at John's boots, but Martin doesn't want to slow down the pace here. He just wants to set the stage and move on to what's important. Also, notice how when I alter the internal structure of this sentence, the word pair slippery mud goes from the end to the beginning of the sentence and becomes the subject of the verb, while if I were to shift the entire excerpt from passive to active, the structure of the other sentences wouldn't change much at all. The Black brothers folded their tents and fed their horses, all the while chewing on strips of salt beef. Yarm and Buckwell's scouts tightened the girths on their saddles, and they set out. This is more like how I would have written it. I've noticed Martin has more of a fondness for the passive voice than I do. I tend to use it more sparingly, but to each his own. It's hard to say there's a right or wrong way when it comes down to the subtleties of writing. In the end, it all comes down to the preferences of the reader. Now, before we move on to the fifth category, I'd like to read you a second excerpt that uses the passive voice to describe something that is perceived, because here it is not only a description of something physical, but of the prospective character's impression of another. It seemed to Tyrion that the lad had grown 3 inches since being knighted. Lancel had thick sandy hair, green Lannister eyes, and a line of soft blonde fuzz on his upper lip. At 16, he was cursed with all the certainty of youth, unleavened by any trace of humor or self-doubt, and wed to the arrogance that came so naturally to those born blonde and strong and handsome. His recent elevation had only made him worse. When it comes to elegant sentences like this one, I think you'll agree that the passive voice really shines. In this case, it is the active voice that would sound a bit off. Imagine if I tried to write something like, "The certainty of youth cursed him, not a trace of humor or self-doubt leavened him, and the arrogance that came so naturally to those born blonde and strong and handsome had, at 16, devoured the last scraps of his humility." Now, that last clause actually turned out pretty cool, but I'd say the first two are rather clumsy, as anticipated. Are you starting to see when and where each voice shines? If not, don't worry. Examining these last two structures should do the trick. So let's dive into the fifth and sixth prose structures, namely intermingling both the passive and active voices within first a perceptive sequence, then within an action sequence. We'll look at two perceptive examples first, so that we can end with the extended excerpt, which includes a bit of everything but is primarily an action sequence. The pale pink light of dawn sparkled on branch and leaf and stone. Every blade of grass was carved from emerald, every drip of water turned to diamond. Flowers and mushrooms alike wore coats of glass. Even the mud puddles had a bright brown sheen. Through the shimmering greenery, the black tents of his brothers were encased in a fine glaze of ice. Notice the alternating structure. The first sentence is active, with light sparkled. The second is passive, with grass was. The third returns to the active voice, with flowers and mushrooms wore, and the last two are passive, with puddles had and tents were. This tends to be my preferred structure when writing descriptions of setting or character, because you get both the impact of the active voice as well as the easy reading of the passive voice. And notice here, here, and here, how the passive voice even sounds a bit active, with the verbs carved, turned, and encased, all ending with ed, as opposed to ing. All that would be needed to turn this last sentence into an active one, for example, would be to mirror the internal structure, as in, a fine glaze of ice encased the black tents of his brothers. You can also use the passive voice to write transition sentences within an otherwise active description, as is done here. Confusion and clangor ruled the castle. Men stood on the beds of wagons loading casks of wine, sacks of flour, and bundles of new-fletched arrows. Smiths straightened swords, knocked dents from breastplates, and shoed destriers and pack-mules alike. Mail shirts were tossed in barrels of sand and rolled across the lumpy surface of the flowstone yard to scour them clean. Outside the walls, tents and pavilions were coming down. Squires tossed pails of water over cook fires, while soldiers took out their oilstones to give their blades one last good lick. The noise was a swelling tide. Horses blowing and whickering, lords shouting commands, men-at-arms trading curses, camp-followers squabbling. Lord Tywin Lannister was marching at last. Of all the passive sentences in this sequence, these two here exist for the purpose of smoothing over the transition from one area of focus to another. First, the goings-on inside the castle are being described, until the passive sentence, outside the walls, tents and pavilions were coming down, guides the narrative focus to what is happening outside the castle. More description ensues, before Martin caps it all off with the passive sentence, Lord Tywin Lannister was marching at last, transitioning his narrative away from the description of the castle entirely, and toward information that is more directly relevant to the plot. Now, before I leave you to digest all that's been said here, let's tie everything together by examining a chronological sequence of narrative segments that together capture the essence of the Siege of King's Landing, so you can see how Martin structures his writing on a larger scale, mixing both the active and passive voices in a style uniquely his own. Ashore, the arms of great trebuchets rose 1, 2, 3, and 100 stones climbed high into the yellow sky. Each one was as large as a man's head. When they fell, they sent up great gouts of water, smashed through oak planking, and turned living men into bone and pulp and gristle. All across the river, the first line was engaged. Grappling hooks were flung out, iron rams crashed through wooden hulls, boarders swarmed, flights of arrows whispered through each other in the drifting smoke, and men died, but so far, none of his. The warrior must have been listening. Black Betha and Lady Maria slammed into the side of Lady Shame within an instant of each other, ramming her fore and aft with such force that men were thrown off the deck of Lady of Silk 3 boats away. Davos almost bit his tongue off when his teeth jarred together. He spat out blood. Next time close your mouth, you fool. 40 years at sea, and yet this was the first time he'd rammed another ship. His archers were loosing arrows at will. Back water, he commanded. When Black Betha reversed her oars, the river rushed into the splintered hole she left, and Lady Shame fell to pieces before his eyes, spilling dozens of men into the river. Some of the living swam, some of the dead floated. The ones in heavy mail and plate sank to the bottom, the quick and the dead alike. The pleas of drowning men echoed in his ears. Men wreathed in green flame leapt into the water, shrieking like nothing human. On the walls of King's Landing, spitfires were belching death, and the great trebuchets behind the mudgate were throwing boulders. One the size of an ox crashed down between Black Betha and Wraith, rocking both ships and soaking every man on deck. Another, not much smaller, found bold laughter. The Valyrian galley exploded like a child's toy dropped from a tower, spraying splinters as long as a man's arm. A jagged piece of wood flew past his head, sharp as any spear. Davos flinched. "Board her," he shouted. Grappling lines were flung. He drew his sword and led them over the rail himself. The crew of the White Hart met them at the rail, but Black Betha's men-at-arms swept over them in a screaming steel tide. Davos fought through the press, looking for the other captain, but the man was dead before he reached him. As he stood over the body, someone caught him from behind with an axe, but his helm turned the blow, and his skull was left ringing when it might have been split. Dazed, it was all he could do to roll. His attacker charged, screaming. Davos grasped his sword in both hands and drove it up point first into the man's belly. Cat was taking on men from the fast-sinking Courageous. The captain of Dragonsbane had driven her between two quays, ripping out her bottom. Her crew poured ashore with archers and men-at-arms to join the assault on the walls. Red Raven, rammed, was slowly listing. Stag of the Sea was fighting fires and borders both, but the fiery heart had been raised over Joffrey's loyal man. Fury, her proud bow smashed in by a boulder, was engaged with God's grace. He saw Lord Valerian's pride of Driftmark crash between two Lannister river runners, overturning one and lighting the other up with fire arrows. On the south bank, knights were leading their mounts aboard the cogs, and some of the smaller galleys were already making their way across, laden with men-at-arms. With a grinding, splintering, tearing crash, Swordfish split the rotted hulk asunder. She burst like an overripe fruit, but no fruit had ever screamed that shattering wooden scream. From inside her, Davos saw green gushing from 1,000 broken jars, poison from the entrails of a dying beast, glistening, shining, spreading across the surface of the river. Then he heard a short, sharp woof, as if someone had blown in his ear. Half a heartbeat later came the roar. The deck vanished beneath him, and black water smashed him across the face, filling his nose and mouth. He was choking, drowning. Unsure which way was up, Davos wrestled the river in blind panic until suddenly he broke the surface. He spat out water, sucked in air, grabbed hold of the nearest chunk of debris, and held on. Swordfish and the hulk were gone. Blackened bodies were floating downstream beside him, and choking men clinging to bits of smoking wood. 50 feet high, a swirling demon of green flame danced upon the river. It had 12 hands, in each a whip, and whatever they touched burst into fire. What I want to draw your attention to here, and the reason I wanted to unpack a longer excerpt, is how Martin alternates between what the perspective character Davos does and what he perceives. This action sequence begins by setting the scene, describing what Davos perceives, and as you can see, Martin mixes both the active and passive voices. This next chunk then focuses on Davos's actions and their immediate consequences, and naturally the voice turns more active. In the third chunk, we zoom out again and take another look at the goings-on in his surroundings, much of which is active, but there is a dynamic passive sequence as well, one we touched on earlier. Again, notice how this passive sentence generates a more distant feel to the actions being described, while the active ones give more of an immediate punch. This next sequence then returns to the actions of Davos himself, and again is written largely in the active voice, with structures like wood flew, Davos flinched, he drew, then led, the crew met, men-at-arms swept, Davos fought, he stood, someone caught him, his helm turned, his attacker charged, Davos grasped, then drove. Martin then switches back to what Davos perceives, and as you can see, Martin's voice becomes far more passive, with structures like Cat was, Red Raven was, Stag of the Sea was, Fury was, Knights were, and smaller galleys were. I should also note that Martin tends to use sensory verbs like he saw, he heard, or he felt, which I am personally not a fan of. Instead of writing, he saw Lord Valerian's pride of Driftmark crash between two Lannister river runners, I would much prefer to write, Lord Valerian's pride of Driftmark crashed between two Lannister river runners, because the river knows that Davos is the perspective character, so writing he saw is redundant, as well as lending a more passive feel to the description. That being said, I'm sure there are readers who like an author's prose to be explicit and straightforward, so again, to each his own. Let me know in the comments what you think. We see this again in the next sequence, which zooms back into Davos and his personal actions. I would have written something like, from inside the hull of the ship, a green liquid gushed from 1,000 broken jars. This is sort of my one pet peeve with Martin's writing. Otherwise, I think it's terrific, a great balance between elegance and easy reading. But again, as you can see, the closer Martin brings us to the direct, immediate experience of the perspective character, the more he tends to write in the active voice, as is only natural to do, with structures like Swordfish split and She burst. This last sequence actually begins with what I would call an acceptable use of the verb he heard, because it would be cumbersome to try and describe the sound woof actively, and the passive alternative, there was a short sharp woof, isn't really any different than he heard a short sharp woof. The sequence which follows is then a blend of both the active and passive voices, alternating more rapidly between what Davos does or happens to him and what is going on in his surroundings. Martin's voice is predominantly active when describing the former, with sentence structures like the deck vanished, Blackwater smashed, Davos wrestled, he broke, he spat, sucked, grabbed, and held. And then, to describe what's happening around Davos, Martin uses the passive voice as a transition, zooming out with the passive sentence, Swordfish and the Hulk were gone. Blackened bodies were floating downstream beside him, and choking men clinging to bits of smoking wood. Now that we're zoomed out, Martin returns to the active voice to zoom back in on another topic of focus, namely the devastation of the wildfire, which he describes with active verbs like danced and burst. Anyway, I hope you found it helpful looking at Martin's prose through this active-passive lens. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and as always, like and subscribe for more technical writing videos.